fellow at the LLM program in Environmental Law and Policy at Stanford Law School. Her research focuses on management of natural resources law, and having been a student, I am very sure of her capability when it comes to water law, and it's borderline intimidating. So I'm sure you guys will have a good look at it and know for yourself. We also have with us Ms. Alexandra Campbell Ferrari. She is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. She is also an adjunct professor at George Washington University School of Law School and American University Washington College of Law. She specializes in US and EU law, and she's also been a Fulbright scholar. Both of our panelists, Vanessa and Alexandra, are very acclaimed authors as well, and we'll get to know more about their work as we go along further in this discussion. We also have Arpit Chaturvedi, who is the co-founder and CEO of Global Policy Insights. It's one of the most prominent think tanks in India, and he is also a co-founder with me at NVPOL. He's also the instructor and academic coordinator at Indian School of Public Policy and holds an MPA degree from Cornell University with a focus on governance, politics, and policy studies. And like the rest of our speakers, he is also an accomplished author. Most prominently, his work, Our Egalitarian Universe, has been sort of a game changer in the Indian polity over the last couple of years. I am Ishan Chaturvedi, and I am an environmental and energy lawyer. I practice in the Supreme Court of India. I am also the Assistant Dean at Jindal School for Environment and Sustainability. It's the only environment-centric school in India. I am also the co-founder of NVPOL and have authored some things that might be relevant to our discussion as well going forward. So I would not take any more of your time, and I'll just quickly explain the structure to all of you, all of our audience and participants, and then we can go into the meat of the discussion. So the idea is that we'll have more like a roundtable chat where we discuss issues to and fro and discuss our experience and anecdotes from our experience. And in the meanwhile, the chat option would be blocked. And after a certain amount has passed, we'll open the chat option so that we can receive your questions on the chat box. And we'll also, once the discussion is over, allot around 15 to 20 minutes to address all of your questions. We'll give you an option where you can raise your hand on your Zoom window, and we'll come to you and let you address the gathering and ask your question then. So without further ado, we must take advantage of the people we have. And I start with Alexandra because one of the most pertinent pieces that I've read about effect of pandemic on water security and justice of sorts, Alexandra, has been something that your organization recently came out with. It's basically discussing the whole ambit of how different laws and different scenarios in this lockdown have not really had the desired result on the water security that one would assume, irrespective of the lockdown, but especially given the current lockdown. So if you could address as to how the pandemic or the lockdown due to the COVID-19 has had an effect on the water justice and water security aspect in the US especially.
Sure, and Ishan, I first want to thank you so much for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this conversation, and I look forward to getting everybody's questions as they come in. So I think Ishan is referencing a report, and I'm happy to provide a link to it if people are interested. But about a month ago, our organization issued a report on the different legal measures that had been taken in the United States to ensure that people had access to water. This was in some respect a follow-on to a report that we did focusing on Maryland, looking at local level laws. And to provide a very quick kind of context here, in the United States, and I think for the most part across the world, it's local areas, local governments that have the authority to issue different laws governing how water and sanitation services are provided. Particularly when it comes to access and affordability and water shutoffs and all those kinds of things. And so in Maryland, we found that a lot of the laws essentially create an environment in which low-income families are likely to lose access to water if they are experiencing financial hardships. there are very few protections in place, very few low-income rate assistance programs offered. From what we could see, very few, if any, had lifeline rates that were offered. We looked at the number of notices that were issued beforehand, different aspects that give you a sense as to kind of what kind of benefit of the doubt, so to speak, a low-income family would have before their water is shut off, and it doesn't look good. So in the time of the pandemic, one of our concerns is that, I think there's a misconception that most people in the United States have access to water, and I actually think that we have a larger issue here than we even know of, in large part because there's just a lack of data transparency. So there's one state as of a 2018 law, and that's California, that actually requires water utilities to issue data that shows that utilities have actually executed shutoffs on a monthly basis, but the reports come out annually. And so one of our concerns, essentially, kind of knowing this context, one of our concerns was that in the time of a pandemic, access to water was our frontline defense. That was really, it's still kind of really all we have because we don't have a vaccine. And so essentially our question was, how many people are at risk of losing access given the economic climate as well, right? We have had a significant rise in unemployment. Millions of people have lost their jobs. And so what we found is that of the 50 states, only 13 states in the District of Columbia have issued statewide moratoriums on water shutoffs. And frankly, the report was issued a month ago, so I would likely believe that several of those moratoriums had actually expired by this time. And at the time that we issued the report, a number of them had already expired. So it's a long way to say that the law has not necessarily been very protective of ensuring access to water despite your ability to pay. And frankly, there's a lot to think about and a lot to do to, I guess, to think about if this were to happen again, should this be the approach that we take?
Yeah, no, and I think this kind of resonates, and it's more global. The same thing could be extrapolated across the countries and federal structures across the globe as well. And I think it brings us to a very important point. First of all, one thing and data transparency in these issues that we'll have to check with other states and other countries as well, because I think US still would be in a better position as compared to probably, and you worked in Africa as well, so you handled that task as well, and you'd know the dichotomy of the whole situation. But I think this might be a good time to ask Vanessa about, because like Alexandra spoke of laws, and then there's municipal laws, and obviously there are state laws and federal laws, and there are various structures through which water can be governed, and there is the need to have these water markets governed as well at some point in time. What is your experience, Vanessa, with the role of the government per se, and how could this be streamlined into probably a more efficient mechanism?
That's a very good and a very difficult question. I don't think I have a straightforward answer. What is true is that if we were scientists, we would probably decide to manage everything related to water, right, on the basin level. That's not what we have, and it's not what we are going to have, and I am not sure it's even totally desirable. And the reason why I'm saying that, it's because, right, political units don't map ecological units. And water is so special that there are political pressures, and even if you want, feelings or attachment from communities to the water that require at least participation of everyone, and maybe not a fully technocratic system of governance. Having said that, one thing, when you talk about water markets, there are many different ways you could define that. In part of my work, I just focus on the exchange of water rights, but here I am going to try to think of markets globally, and that includes also privatization. So one of the things that we are seeing is that more in Europe, or initially, historically, Europe had more private water suppliers than the US had, but this is changing. So let's think of something totally different. If I paint my house, the quality may not be great, but I have full control over it. If I hire someone, that someone I will have to control, and I may be better or worse at controlling him. So one of the things that we may be seeing is that, once you privatize water utilities, you are losing or you may be gaining in efficiency. That's what people that advocate for privatization claim, right? Private companies are better at managing a
Innovation
system
and
of
management.
pipes and serving, but the government has to control them. It is impossible to control them, right? No, it's possible, but it's extremely difficult. And these water utilities are not just a very local private company. They are usually part of giant companies. So the imbalance of power also plays a role there. So whether, like there is a report by the Pacific Institute about how to do privatization right that I think it's very helpful in order to ensure that the community is heard, that we take into account those that are most in need in that community. Because of course, if you have government, you may feel a pressure or even a mandate to ensure that everyone has access to water. If you have a private company, they will be less likely to serve low-income individuals because those are not exactly, the ones that are going to bring the revenue. Yeah. Obviously, you have mechanisms, and we have them in other industries, to make those private companies comply with the universal mandate of access. And I am slightly optimistic about what COVID-19 could mean for water access, because one thing COVID-19 has that previous, if you want, or previous not even existing illnesses doesn't, is that it's classes agnostic, right? Rich and poor get sick. While there are a lot of waterborne illnesses that, millions of children die every year all over the world, but because the developing world and the certain affluent people don't get affected by, we don't do anything about it. But now we know that if poor people don't wash their hands, rich people may get, I'm sorry to be so blunt, the virus. So we may see an increase, or at least a push to guarantee water access. Obviously, this comes in two ways, right? Like there are counter forces. At the same time, we're facing a global recession. There will be either less investment, and at the same time, some stimulus packages that may be directed towards water. So we don't know how these different forces pulling us in different directions will end up playing out. So to answer your question, there is no efficient level. I don't have like the blueprint of how we should structure our water system to make it efficient and at the same time equitable or just. What is clear is that the community has to be heard, and that we have to define what the goals are. Once we define what the goals are, no matter which is the public or private and the different components, there should be some mechanisms to enforce those goals. If you have the right to water in your constitution, it may take a long time, but you will try to enforce it even for informal settlements. And that has to be clear, right? Like, oh yes, South Africa is doing so much better. Yeah, but what about the informal settlements in South Africa? Are we guaranteeing them access to water?
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And one thing that, and I think the ideology behind water issues has also changed, because people have started appreciating the inherent value, and how that inherent value is not reflecting in the price of water. So even in the best case scenario in most of the countries around the globe, it's just operational costs, maybe a fraction of the capital cost of having an infrastructure of water dispensation, and perhaps a couple of other costs. But basically, that inherent value has barely been considered, and I think that goes to the issue of water being a public good under the common law within the doctrine of public trust, or it being a private good which can be managed better. And Arpit, I know that you worked on this whole concept of public and private in various scenarios. So would you probably want to reflect upon that?
So I'm going to use did you call me, or who did
No.
you call?
You could go ahead, Vanessa.
Okay. I'm just going to say, I'm going to use actually the phrase of Buzz Thompson at the Stanford that Isha knows well, which I think the best way to define water is as a public commodity, right? Where you have to take into account efficiency, you have to take into account the environment, and you have to take into account that everyone should have some level of access to it. I don't think it's feasible right now to think of water as a pure public good that is going to be governed by government and that's it. that trend has passed. And there may be situations where privatized utilities are, bought by the public government again and so on. But I just think that we are facing a mix, and what we have to figure out is how to make that mix work.
Yeah, yeah. Arthur?
I mean, I agree with Vanessa on this, that we need to look at water as a public commodity and not as a public good, because public good essentially, as we know, has two features: that a public good is non-rival and non-excludable, which means that you cannot stop somebody from using it if they pay or they don't pay. That's being non-excludable, and it's non-rival because my consumption of water or any public good that we generally think of as public good, like clean air, should not reduce your consumption of clean air. So it's non-rival. But then now, we have come to an era where we cannot look at water like that. And unfortunately, that's been the case with a lot of different public goods. So my first thing that I want to offer over here is that post-COVID, I think some of the trends which we are seeing overall in the world, they're going to get accelerated. And one of the trends that I see is the privatization of public goods. And that's a long-term trend that we are seeing generally. So, I mean, let's think of air right now, clean air. Right now, there's a consensus that clean air is definitely a public good. But if you extrapolate in the future, you could clearly see that clean air is going to be non-excludable. It's going to be excludable very soon, because when you see that there are some nations which are contributing more to the pollution and have more polluted air around them because they have to pursue a path of industrial development, those nations will not be able to have clean air, countries like India. On the other hand, the countries which can actually invest in environmental friendly technologies and practices, they will have clean air. So if you look at a global level, you have to be a really, really rich person to be able to live in a country where you have clean air. And you can look at water in similar ways that, if you're living in a country where there's a lot of pollution for water, gradually, it's not just, natural scarcity, it's also man-made scarcity that's going to make water a rival as well as excludable commodity. Again, jumping back to clean air, you could easily think like water, like my consumption of water reduces your consumption of water if we have limited fresh water. Similarly, we have limited clean air, right? Fast forward 100, 150 years down the line, we know that there's limited oxygen in the atmosphere, and out of that oxygen, there's only a limited, quantity, which is probably clean. So, just like we are going towards paid water, bottled water, things like those, you'd see, hilarious videos right now on YouTube where people are selling air from the Himalayas or different places. But then you would not be surprised if we are living in a future where, you could buy clean air and you'd probably be just roaming around with masks attached to cylinders by your side. So that's what I think is gonna. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope it doesn't get to that. But then, I do see a trend of a public good turning into a public commodity, turning into a club good, and then turning into a private good. That's probably the end game.
So a couple of really good points that I think I have personally never thought of water as, obviously I've thought of it as a private good, but never in the sense that my consumption of water would eventually reduce the other person's consumption of water. We do look at these things when we talk of environmental justice and water justice and such issues, because one very important aspect which we should address during this discussion is, as well, is that the long and short of this whole scenario is always that there are certain communities which are suffering more than the others. And I was, in fact, Vanessa referred to Buzz. I was Buzz Thompson of Stanford Law School, and I was recently watching one of his talks where it was basically suggested that the Sultan of Brunei owns a couple of hundred hectares in Vegas, and his property consumes around 17.5 million gallons of water just for upkeeping that property. And that obviously means that there's less water for those communities that cannot afford that sort of a for that sort of tax. And which brings me to this whole concept of, and this is being practiced elsewhere in the world as well. I know for a fact that in New South Wales, I think they have a cap and trade system for water usage as well. And if I'm not wrong, and Alexandra could probably jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, some parts of the US, some municipalities and states as well are using the cap and trade system to address the water shortage. And where do you stand on this whole water tax versus cap and trade and issuing these certificates and opening up the market for water usage and water consumption? And where do you see it going forward?
Honestly, I think the whole water rights system in the US, honestly around the world, needs to be, and I like this term and hate this term, but disrupted. I mean, it really needs to be shifted. Our whole kind of conceptualization of water, I think, needs to change. And I think especially within countries, right? So we have, you know, in the US, and I've seen this in El Salvador where we've been working recently, and I've seen this in other areas, you know, even within countries, different parts of those countries are very protective over the water within their jurisdictional boundaries. And what we're forgetting is that the decisions that we're making in one area are having impacts and effects outside of that area, within the country and then outside of the country. And so, you know, this concept of sovereignty, I think, is really, I think the concepts of sovereignty and ownership are really holding back this area. It's stopping us from thinking more innovatively. It's stopping us from really asking bigger questions of, you know, what are the priorities? You know, when it comes to like who should get the water? And you know, one of the things that we've been talking, my colleague and I, but when we've been talking about these issues is, you know, when you are creating a water rights system, you know, the very first thing is that everybody should get access to enough water for their domestic purposes, even if everybody else's use has to stop. Like business, I mean, your domestic purposes should always be a priority. I mean, everyone needs the water for hygienic purposes, for drinking. It doesn't matter. And I mean, I know in the US also the rhetoric is very much focused on the economy. Like the economy has to survive at the expense of health and well-being. And I think that's also really dangerous to this space, is that it's not a competition. And frankly, the economy cannot survive, the economy cannot thrive if we are not healthy. And water is an essential component of that. One of the things that I had wanted to jump in and say earlier also is that I think the utilities themselves have become a little bit they've become little fiefdoms. And I think that that's a little dangerous, right? They have, it's again, this idea of sovereignty and ownership and like business. And, you know, one of the things that we've also looked is that, you know, what we found is that all that revenue that is generated by a utility and that's collected from customers isn't necessarily being reinvested in the infrastructure. Sometimes it's actually going into the city's general fund or the state's general fund. And so then we start to ask ourselves, well, why is infrastructure failing? Well, because, and then, you know, why don't they have enough money to fund low-income rate assistance programs? Or why can't they offer lifeline rates? Or why can't they even give, you know, which essentially is free water to those people who just cannot pay? You know, they can't do it because their money is going somewhere else. Or even worse, the rates that these utilities are charging is being driven by politics because they don't want to raise the rates, but the rates that they're charging is technically covering maybe only half of the expenses that they have. And I think that, you know, there's just so many, like before I even get into or even start thinking about whether or not water should be private or commoditized or traded or anything, like there's some really basic questions that we have to answer. Like, what are the priorities? And what, you know, what should we, how do we think about the infrastructure? What are we doing with all of this? Like, what is, and I think Vanessa said this earlier, like, what are the goals of this? Like, what do we want? And if a priority is making sure everyone's health and well-being is protected and we have access to drinking water, then that has to be the priority at the expense of everything else, which frankly won't be at the expense of everything else. I think we'll finally see greater, you know, if you want to look at countries that, you know, across Africa, right? You look at these numbers, and actually, and then I will stop, but, you know, there's something, there's a lot of discussion about the SDGs and they're needing to be achieved by 2030. And a lot of people are starting to say, well, that's not realistic. And I'm like, well, it's not realistic for you because you already have access to water. But, you know, honestly, like if this was, if people wanted, if everybody wanted truly, if the political leaders of our time wanted people to have access to water, they would make it happen. It's just not happening. It just isn't a priority. And you can see that it's not a priority in the law. You can see it in their finances. I mean, if you want it to happen, you'll make it happen. It's just, it's not a priority. And I think we have to come to terms with that.
So I think this is a very important point. And at some point before we end the discussion, I'd also want to talk about the solution to this, because I understand that it is and should be made an absolute priority, given the fact that by 2050 our water demand is supposed to rise almost 4 times, and especially with Asia's case, it's getting terrible with all of the factors of environmental diplomacy, you know, China damming those rivers that feed 1.3 billion people downstream, and all of those things. So we would like to address that as well. But before that, because we're talking of priorities, and I have read Vanessa's book, which basically deals with, I think the title of the book was Go with the Flow, if I'm not wrong. And that had dealt with water as an essential resource, and how water management and water markets need to be basically the lessons that could be incorporated in these systems to make sure that that essential resource of water is available to all. And that kind of also touches upon equity. So Vanessa, would you want to address that for a bit?
So yeah, I am not sure. I mean, that's not the title of my book. So I think you are, that's something I have worked on in different places.
Okay.
So let's be clear, like the amount of water we need to cover our basic needs is very low compared to the amount of water we globally use. So as Alessandra was pointing out, we could make it happen, right? If 98% is allocated through markets, but the 2% that we need is allocated based on need, the world will not end. And we are not going to have people using water that, you know, the idea is if you give water very cheap, people are gonna use too much. Well, you can cap this, right? There are many ways we can do it. And I am not a big fan of the system in some places in South Africa, but there is a situation where you can actually cap consumption. Your water shuts down once you have reached a certain level. And if we fix that certain level, taking into account the people on the household, climate and whatnot, that should be doable. And of course, the infrastructure piece is the expensive one. And this is where we have to find out, you know, how to fund it. But if we reset our priorities and we think that's what has to happen, you know, also in an economy that needs a stimulus, that's infrastructure that needs to be built. So why don't make that instead of roads or whatnot, especially now that we have realized that maybe we need to commute less. Having said that, one thing that I am actually missing a little bit in this discussion is also the environment, right? We seem to be thinking, let's ensure water justice, but we also need to ensure like the ecosystem. And as Alessandra was saying, we need to rethink the system. So one thing I like to do in my water law class is to start by asking the students, without knowing anything about water or whatever they know, but how they will design a water system, right? Like from scratch. And that's probably not something we can do, even though we have examples like Australia where the water rights system was completely redone. And now you have like 4 types of water rights that kind of, you know, work like a puzzle, and that seems to work well for them after the millennium drought. But there are changes we need to introduce, and the way we set rates needs to change. I am not sure what's the best way, right? But the fact that it's so politically charged, and the fact that there will be cross-subsidization no matter what, so let's make it transparent, may be a better way to go. So for example, California faces the worst drought in history, and you, some of you were there during that crisis. It turns out the way the water rate is set in California, it doesn't allow you to account for scarcity. So you cannot disincentive consumption based on the idea we don't have enough water. You can only increase the rate if you need extra infrastructure, right? So this is something that in the 21st century has no role to play. If we believe that, you know, we need to be mindful of our water consumption, then we should take into account, the value of scarcity. So is there a way to really ensure water as an essential commodity? There are several, right? And we have played with many other issues, with different tools in many other goods that are essential. You could have, and none of this is perfect, and the problem is that we don't do enough in water. You could have vouchers. You could have basic needs rates that it's almost zero. You could have rates that are based on income. You could have some sort of subsidies coming any other way that you can think of. But it shouldn't be that difficult to ensure access to water. It may not be, having water at your home in some countries. It may be just having water nearby, and that's already an improvement. But we need it, like for sanitation, for health, to cook, for everything. And it's great to talk about, or when the First World talks, is like these goals, as Alessandra was saying, are not, they cannot be met. Well, they may have a reason to say that because they have not done anything to meet them. Even in the US, there are households without access to water in the Central Valley.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And just taking cue from what Vanessa said, after this, when it comes to, this is one side of the story, especially with the US, but I think Alexandra also referred to, and she's done substantial work in Africa as well. This equity-based system can be enforced in countries where you can, account for each person who's staying at a certain place, and if he has a water connection and nearby at least. What happens in a polity like India or some parts of Africa and China as well, when there are 1.5 billion people living and you cannot account for each of them? You can barely half of them, and most of them do not have water connections. Some of them don't have electricity connections as well. So how do you account for a bottom-up approach where you kind of try and revamp the infrastructure in a way that, because there are obviously steps to this, so you account for each one, and then there's water availability. And what about the cost of this infrastructure? Because if they do not have the connection, that means that there is no infrastructure. That means that there is an expense waiting for the government to undertake. So how do you address this conundrum of sorts?
Sure. I think that's a very good question, especially considering what I'd like to build on what Alexandra and Vanessa just said. Two things stood out for me. Alexandra said that, utilities have become fiefdom. And sometimes utilities, we are not able to provide utilities to those who cannot afford the utilities. Similarly, Vanessa said that there's a power distance between these big private players who provide these utilities and the citizens. Now the question arises that why is it that we cannot provide utilities to those who cannot afford it? And the problem is here, according to me, which is that we look at citizens as customers. We have this whole new public management paradigm of looking at governance. I think that has led us to look at citizens as customers. On the other hand, what we need, and that's something which is already being practiced in different parts of the world, is looking at citizens as equal stakeholders in the society. And when you're coming up with public policy, you have to have citizen participation right from the formulation stage of public policy to the implementation of it. So, for example, if you're coming up with a system where the government is regulating the water distribution industry, the private sector is providing water in reality, you need people to be involved with them in evaluating whether the water has reached people who really needed it the most. You need people to decide in a particular locality that, hey, okay, we have this much budget, and we have to decide from bottom up that what are our priorities. Maybe if we don't have water in our area, then maybe we don't need that new flyover which is going to be built. Let's build that budget together and let's bring in water first, and then we'll think about other things such as Wi-Fi or the flyover or things like those. So uh, I think not only in countries like India or other developing countries, this is a huge paradigm shift. And I agree when Vanessa and Alexandra they say that we have to define the goal. And if our end goal is that citizens are every citizen should get water, then every citizen must have a say in how these resources are allocated, how governance is done. And there are different ways. I mean, we are still learning, but then uh, there are places across the world where public participation in coming up with budgets has been very successful. You see those models in Rosario in Argentina, in places in Brazil, even in New Delhi now. So I think those are some of the things which are extremely, extremely important, just changing our paradigm about how we do governance. I think while Ishan joins us back again, do you think, Alexandra or Vanessa, do you think that there's any role for this sort of a public-private participation and citizen participation in managing the delivery of water generally, even in the US and other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it depends, right? I mean, some of the examples I've seen are, I mean, frankly, if the same regulations that apply to public utilities apply to private utilities, then I think, yes, you can ensure that there are certain protections in place, that ensure that if there's private, utility, if there's private participation, that it doesn't become an ownership of water, but that they're just the one providing the service instead of the government. And I don't necessarily see that as an issue. And I mean, I think the underlying concern that many people have is that one, that private participation in the water sector means a privatization of water, and that second, that if the private government or if a private utility or private entity is involved, that means that it's all about revenue. And I think that for them that may be the case, but as long as there's certain things in place, like for example, if there was a public utility commission that oversaw private utilities and said, look, in the event of certain, in the event that people aren't paying for their water bills, these things have to happen before you turn off water, or you're forbidden from turning off water for certain people in certain income categories. There's a lot of ways that you can go about providing protections that, would still allow for governments to benefit from private participation, but provide those protections. And I think actually, this is harking back to something that Vanessa said, I don't necessarily know if there's there isn't a one size fits all solution in every area. And I think that, as a lawyer, we're constantly, I'm constantly searching for that, right? Like, I really want to believe that there's one law and one approach and one provision that's going to solve every issue. And I don't think that's the case. And the more and more that we kind of dig into this, I think, I still don't think that water is a local issue. And I continue to push back on that in many ways, because I think there needs to be a pushback on that. But I think it's more of this idea of that there might be general ideas, like everyone should have access to water, that should apply to everywhere. But how they achieve that and the approach that you take to achieving it could very much differ. So I think in some areas that public-private partnership is going to be fantastic. Everyone's going to love it. It's going to do great. In other areas, it's just not going to work. And maybe because the government actually could do a good job, or maybe there's just a lack of trust, or maybe there isn't a private operator. So I like to, I like us to challenge ourselves to think about kind of those broad principles that would apply across all jurisdictions, but think about, does that mean that it should or has to? If that makes sense.
Absolutely, that makes sense.
So, guys, I'm sorry, I kind of dropped off a little, and I think it's a very good omen every time you have a webinar and your internet goes off. I think that kind of makes it all normal and more human. Before Alexandra and after we get Vanessa's thoughts on this topic, I just wanted to quickly, and then we also have very little time left, and we have to address questions as well. But Alexandra, and out of curiosity, and I've been meaning to ask you this for quite some time now, because you did this massive project I think it was called Renewal, but I've been proven wrong about my recollections from the past and reading. So I think it was called Renewal, your project in Africa, where you basically went over almost all the legal structures which concerned water laws and
Mhm.
kind of compiled all of them together. And I'm not sure if there were any recommendations to your report, but were these issues such as making water available to all, and not just as a matter of right like it is in South Africa, but actually delivering water to doorsteps of all domestic users. Were these issues addressed in those policies in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, you did actually get the name of it correct. So
Validation.
yes, so our renewal project, for those who don't know, our hope is to actually launch it fully at the end of this summer. But in the end, it will be the first, or I mean, it currently is, but it only covers 5 countries at this point. But in the end, it will be the first kind of Pan-African water law platform. And in large part, if you work in this law and policy space, what you find is that this information is really challenging to find. And it's really difficult to track kind of what law is currently applicable, how it's been amended, by whom, who has what role. I mean, it's just all really difficult to find. And actually, as an interesting component to that, even when, we've done a lot of field work in these countries, even when you start to talk to people about what laws apply and where they apply, not everybody has the same opinion. So there's a lot of aspects to this that get very interesting. We're still looking at trends, but honestly, I mean, it kind of ties it back into what I was saying. I think all countries are making an effort in their laws. I think some laws do it better than others. I think Kenya's law that was just rewritten in 2016 is a stronger example outside of the South African law. I think that it demonstrates I mean, you can see different ways in which the law does actually try to ensure that everybody has access. And I do want to say, I think it goes beyond, I think that you could find a law that doesn't recognize officially a human right to water, and it actually still might do more than a country that does recognize a human right to water to actually deliver on that promise. And that's also what we were trying. We've had all these conversations because when you collect hundreds of laws and you're trying to think about how you synthesize them, my colleague and I have been trying to figure out, well, how do you convey this really complex system of laws to people? And we've tried to get down to some of those root ideas, one of which is very much that declaring that there are certain rights does not mean you necessarily have them. And just to add an even more challenging component is that the court may also interpret it in a different way. So if you look at South Africa, right, they declared there was a human right to water and sanitation. And their people demanded it. I mean, one of the most amazing things you see in South Africa is that people know they have a right. Like people in the informal settlements actually charged up to the government, say, bring me my water. I have a right to water. And they get it. I mean, it's truly phenomenal. But what happens is that there was a court that the courts had to get involved to actually define what that right was. And so the court was like, here's how much water essentially you get. Here's what the human right to water really means. I don't know if that's the best approach. I don't know if it has to be a volumetric kind of designation, but declaring these rights is not enough. And I think that's one thing, if I've seen any theme throughout, declarations of rights are just, they don't go far enough. So you really have to read the law carefully to see if it's truly creating that enabling environment for success. And actually, I do, to reference something that Vanessa said earlier, I think the river basin system, I'm still not seeing that. And I know, I think it's difficult to say whether or not that's the best approach. I think in many respects, it does represent a better approach to water management, but you really are not seeing that still. And it's not necessarily cascading throughout other things, right? Like, is there, when we think about drinking water, we're not necessarily thinking about how and where cities and people are located. Like, we're kind of still missing the boat of the context of how water is provided and where it goes and where it comes from and all that kind of stuff. So there's certain things that we're seeing that that isn't really being reflected in the law still.
Yeah. Vanessa, were you saying something? I thought that you were trying to say something earlier.
No. The internet connection wasn't stable, so I couldn't hear very well. No.
All right. So I think a couple of really good points there. And India has kind of borne the brunt of this in very holistic way, where the fundamental right to life under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution was kind of expanded by the judiciary and the Supreme Court itself to include the right to clean and healthy environment, the right to water, and some, in my humble opinion and respectfully, if I may add, some things to do with right to sleep and such other things, which are, which is ferocious judicial activism. But my point is that there are such rights which have been recognized by the Supreme Court, which are very much the law of the land. But if you look at it from the perspective of rural India and some village folk in some far off corner of India, they are not even aware of those rights, and this is amusing to me because when Alexandra says that there is awareness as regards the rights of water and other such rights in South Africa, that is something that is still missing in India. So I think, Vanessa, I would pick your brains very quickly, and then we'll probably have to get to questions as well. So just your experience, because I really want to address the whole concept of water pricing before we leave this discussion. And
Ishan, we're losing you.
Yeah,
Ishan,
I thought it
can't
was
hear
me.
you.
I mean, we could also do questions while we wait for Ishan to come back in. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Okay, we'll open the chat box and we can have some questions. So anybody who's been listening to us for a while, if you can type your questions in the chat box now, and it's going to be open. And please do let us know whom this question is addressed towards, and we'll try our best to answer those.
Also, Vanessa, I don't know if while people are answering questions, if you wanted to talk about the water pricing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure. I mean, I didn't know what what Ishan was aiming at, but I think we touched upon, and maybe he was not connected at the point about how are we going to set the utility rates, and what are the goals that those utility rates should aim to achieve. If what we want is to reduce consumption, we should price water according to the opportunity cost, the scarcity. It's obvious that will and we are talking about regulated prices here. There are some that believe that we just let the market price water. If we did that, obviously a lot of people will be priced out, and that will cut on goals beyond water management, health, sanitation, and the like. So I think that what we can, once it's not a system, but I think we have to treat different prices for water differently. So one thing is the amount of water that we use in a household and how we're going to set those rates. Something different is water use for economic activities. And here, and even there may be some differing views, right? Should we let the agricultural sector compete with any other type of business? In general, and this I believe it's true across jurisdictions, the agricultural sector, because historically was very important and historically had a lot of political influence, tend to receive water subsidized. That has led to the agricultural sector not being the most efficient it could be. Those things are changing, and the agricultural sector is being very innovative, and there are ways they could even be more efficient. But it may be a goal, and this is what I was saying before, like or Alessandra was mentioning, there is not a one-size-fits-all. If there is not a one-size-fits-all, maybe we should decide whether we want to subsidize the agricultural sector because we believe that food security is more important, or because we believe that there is something about the agricultural sector and the fact that water it's one input that they cannot do without. Even though we have seen, right, with the recent droughts, that farmers now do like these dry tomatoes that tend to taste better than normal tomatoes and so on, that there is something there, and that whenever we structure water markets, we should take into account that. Also, one issue that water pricing does not address, or does not address unless there is a regulation, or it can be addressed, is how do we deal with environmental issues? So if we move water according to the market, what are we gonna do in order to protect the environment, to make sure that there is enough water for the ecosystem to survive? Because if suddenly there is like a new big reservoir of shale gas that needs a lot of water, and all the water from one area is actually, it's feasible to ship it to another area, that first area, the area of origin, it's going to suffer. It's going to suffer because the community may see that they no longer have water for future development because it has been solved, and also the environment. So either we can have a tax in terms of the amount of water that cannot leave that community, or a tax in the sense that part of the price paid will be devoted to protect the water ecosystem in that area. So I think that talking about water pricing is talking about almost everything in water, once we assume that water is a public commodity.
Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm not really sure. So I'll quickly just discuss a bit of an issue with COVID-19 and water, and some of the experiences that we have been noticing in India over the past couple of months. And then we'll get back to a couple of other questions as well. And one of the things that we have observed, and this would be global in nature as well, is that the water quality technically has been improving, and that has obviously happened because the human intervention modes of environment through their businesses and industries and other sectors has uh, reduced drastically. But the last time this happened, due to the global financial crisis in 2008, when there was a 1.7 dip in the carbon emissions overall, there was then a 5.1% rise in the emissions the next year. So while this might be a comforting thought for a lot of us that the general quality of water and environment has gotten better over the last few months, we have to have these systemic changes, relook at policy structures, because this would not sustain as soon as life goes back to normal, as soon as these various measures of lockdown release over the globe over the next couple of months. We would be back to square one when we'd be discussing water policy issues. So this is why we're not just addressing what has been the direct effect of COVID on and the lockdown on water quality, but also how we could actually address these issues that have been systemic over the past few generations now, and what could be the measures that we could take to address these issues. Now, there's a very interesting question, and even though it's and we have a lot of questions, so I'll be sending out my email, and we could probably circulate these questions with our panelists later. But there's a question by Mr. Tantref Fayaz, who says, and this is addressed to you, Alexandra. He is also referring to this whole advent of there's almost a restriction on human intervention, and hence the water quality has improved. Is there any anecdotal reference to how the water quality has been improving, or is there a better reach towards, or maybe this has just been taken as something that could be achieved if there's sustained effort on our part as citizens of the US or around the globe? Is there any difference in water quality that you might have noticed over the last couple of months when it comes to various issues?
Sure. Well, I mean, when I think of water quality, I think there's two issues there. One is the water quality of water bodies and the environment, and then the actual quality of the drinking water, and then also the quality of the wastewater that's being discharged. So
Yeah.
I mean, worldwide, I would say worldwide, we've very much seen a decrease in, or an improvement in some areas of water quality. I think in the U.S., you know, the Clean Water Act was written in 1972. I think we have seen a fairly drastic improvement of water quality. I would say for drinking water, it's unclear. You know, if you look at the number of non-compliant, you know, the utilities that are in non-compliance across the United States, it's fairly large. And what their non-compliance is differs, right? So in Flint, it was lead. In other areas, it's much more associated with fertilizers, right? So where there's a very high agricultural presence, there's a lot of that. I know we've had, I think actually in the US, in terms of litigation, one of the more interesting litigations we had was when the drinking water facility in Iowa, in the capital of Iowa, actually sued the irrigation districts for increasing their costs of having to treat drinking water. Because essentially what they were saying is, you're dumping so much nitrogen, so much phosphorus, so much fertilizer into the water that our treatment costs to treat the surface water and deliver safe drinking water have increased by tenfold. I mean, it was a fairly drastic amount, and they had the numbers to show it. And I think even across the world, right, you see parts of Africa, and I think where you see the improvements are where there's greater transparency. Like the more that you know about how much water is there, what the quality is, the more that you know, the more that people know that there's an issue. And for drinking water, I think it's the same, right? It's, if you have a central provider, then they may have requirements. You know, we saw this in Zambia and other areas. They may have requirements to issue reports saying, well, here's the water quality. They may have requirements to say when there's been a non-compliance. So they'll have to tell their customers, like, there's been a non-compliance.
I think that's a good point. And again, like, one thing that we need to take from this discussion is that there cannot be a one-size-fits-all policy. There cannot be a one-stop shop as a solution to all of these problems. So this is one of the other things. For all the people who are concerned about the recording of this webinar, we'd be sending out the recording to you, and you could refer to our discussion later. Also, there are a lot of questions on urban and rural water systems and how these are different and how these need to be managed better and differently as well. So we would also address those in our responses to the various questions. We have run out of time, unfortunately. It's been over an hour, and I know that Vanessa has quite a few things to take care of herself. So for all the questions that are being asked, we would reply to you privately, and some of the questions we could also circulate with our panelists. I would not want to keep any of you any longer, and I do apologize again for my internet. It has been acting up, and it has never happened before, but I do apologize for it. And thank you to Alexandra and Vanessa and Arpit for taking out the time. The discussion was short but meaningful, and I'd probably go back to the recording myself a couple of times just to follow up on the discussion that we've had today. Is there anything that you'd like to address, any of you, before we pass?
Just thank you for putting this together, Ishan. And I am happy to answer any question that you think it's addressed to me whenever you go through them. So just email me, and I'm happy to send them information or, you know, articles that can work out for them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alexandra?
Well, yes, I have to echo, you know, thank you for putting this together. I think these issues have to be discussed more and more. And I think the questions I'm seeing pop in are fantastic. And some of them are asking the exact right question. And some of them are just, they're great. So I would also invite you, Ishan, you know, please feel free to give out my email address, my @ourwatersecurity.org email address. I'm happy to answer questions directly from participants or to share additional information. So, and thank you to everybody for coming and joining us.
All right, great. Thank you guys for being there. Arpit, is there anything you'd want to address? Or
no, I'd like to thank all of you, Vanessa, Alexandra, and Ishan, for coming together for this. I think very informative and insightful conversation. And as I agree, these conversations should happen more, and happy to answer any questions that come up later.
Yeah, so thank you all, and thanks for joining. We would be getting back to all of our participants and people who've asked questions. Thank you to the Stanford gang for coming along. I'm sure that this was a bit of an attraction for all of you. So thank you, and I'll see you all soon. And again, please think of water in your everyday usage. We consume a lot more than we need, as Vanessa rightly put, and that might be a good start to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much.